Okay, so we are going to talk today about the Enlightenment and the Great Awakening. So let's talk about the Enlightenment, and this is where Europe experiences a scientific revolution. The Polish astronomer Nicholas Copernicus overthrows the idea of a Earth-centered universe with a sun-centered universe. Now, other cultures had done this first time for the Europeans. And what we mean is that for a long time, people thought that the universe went around the Earth. Then, of course, if you looked up in the sky, right, it looks like that's the case. Everything's moving around. Uh, this is sometimes saying overthrowing a geocentric with a heliocentric. And he suggested, no, the sun doesn't go around the Earth goes around the sun. That was new for Europe. But this scientific revolution, known as the Enlightenment, will hit its peak with Sir Isaac Newton. Newton hits upon his theory of gravity and also came up with this idea of natural law, saying that the universe moved in accordance with natural law, which could be grasped by ordinary people by using reason, and it could be explained by mathematics. And so we call this Newtonian science. Well, like with any other science, and we'll talk about this in the second half of history, one could reason that if there was natural law dealing with the universe, why wouldn't there be natural law that would cover things like politics, economics, and society? And that why can't our reason make us understand these natural laws of the way things should be? And there was this idea that if you could understand all these natural laws, then injustice and sin and poverty would go away. And much of the Enlightenment could be reconciled with Christian beliefs. Copernicus and Newton, according to Christians, just showed the glory of God. Puritans accept Newtonian science from the start, but some religious people take Newtonian science to a further level and say, look, what God is a clockmaker. And these people will be the deists, D-E-I-S-T. God is a clockmaker. That God created the universe like a clockmaker makes a clock. The clockmaker winds up the clock and then lets it run. And so for the deists, that's what God did, was that he created the universe, set up all these laws, and lets it run. So the deists wouldn't believe in things like miracles or God intervening anywhere on earth. Now, one of the people that takes this natural law and applies it to politics is going to be John Locke, and he's going to write a treatise on government, and this is going to influence the American Revolution. He believed that natural law meant that people have natural rights, and that meant life, liberty, and property in his minds, and these rights could not be taken away. So you can see that impact on the Declaration of Independence. Now, in America, the Enlightenment fits perfectly because in the New World, people had thrown off old traditions because things that worked in Europe didn't work here. And so you had to experiment, you had to observe and think differently. And the person that epitomizes this more than anybody else is going to be Benjamin Franklin. He's going to epitomize the Enlightenment in America far more than anyone else. He's born in 1706. He's the son of a candle maker and soap maker. He has a nice common touch with people, but he is, of course, intellectually much higher than the rest of them, but he's able to communicate with everybody. He was an apprentice to his brother, who was a printer. He leaves home at 17 to go to Philadelphia, breaking his apprenticeship. At 17, by the age of 24, he owned a print shop where he edited and published the Pennsylvania Gazette. At 27, he bought Poor Richard's Almanac, and he's able to retire at the age of 42. But before he retired, he had helped found a library. He'd helped start the University of Pennsylvania. He had helped start the American Philosophical Society. And he had achieved several scientific achievements, including the invention of the Franklin stove, the lightning rod, the glass harmonica, which Beethoven and Mozart wrote symphonies for, and then bifocals. Well, for every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction if we're going to do Newtonian science, and that's going to be the Great Awakening. The Great Awakening is a backlash against the Enlightenment. As educated classes drifted toward deism and away from Christianity, the clergy began to get worried. And one of those people that was worried was Jonathan Edwards. He was a Congregationalist minister out of Northampton, Massachusetts. In 1716, he entered into Yale at the age of 13, graduated at the valedictorian 4 years later. He became very spiritual in college. Not surprising, Yale was designed to train ministers. In 1727, he marries Sarah Pierpoint, the daughter of New Haven's most prominent minister. They have 11 children, all of which survive. From all accounts, Edwards was very witty, he was charismatic, he was charming, but he had become concerned that Christians had become too materialistic. And so he starts beginning to frighten people with visions of the afterlife, how terrible it would be. By 1735, he's convinced the town's back to normal. He thinks that things are going good. But the true catalyst of the Great Awakening is going to be George Whitefield. Whitefield was a spellbinding evangelist who thought that congregations were lifeless because, quote unquote, dead men preached to them. And he thought that, quote, too many ministers were slothful shepherds and dumb dogs, unquote. He came from England and preached in America. In 1739, he preached to crowds of 6,000 in Philadelphia. Remember, Philadelphia's got about 30,000 people. A fifth of the people are showing up to hear him speak before microphones. He was a dramatic actor. He would rehearse his sermons and impersonate all the agonies of burning because of your sins. He just enthralled audiences. He'd have people come ahead of him and put up posters announcing his arrival. Now, even Ben Franklin, who's the ultimate skeptic, went to hear him speak, emptied his pockets into the collection plate after hearing him speak, and actually became friends with Whitefield. Whitefield wanted to restore the notion of individual salvation. He is not looked upon very kindly by the older traditional clergy. Jonathan Edwards, who we just talked about a moment ago, heard him speak and cried throughout the entire sermon. And he takes advantage of the commotion caused by Whitefield's speeches to begin his own revival. And so this Great Awakening reaches its peak in 1741 when Edwards gives his famous sermon in Massachusetts entitled "Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God." Now, we'll just quote part of it here where he says, "The bow of God's wrath is bent and the arrow made ready on the string, and justice spins the arrow at your heart, and it's nothing but the mere pleasure of God, and that of an angry God, without any promise or obligation at all, that keeps the arrow one moment being drunk with your blood." And then he goes on to say that God holds you over the pit of Hell as much as one holds a spider or loathsome insect over the fire, abhors you, is dreadfully provoked. He looks upon you as worthy of nothing else but to be cast into the fire, unquote. And so the sinners are the hands of an angry God. You can see that, and we're going to get to the second Great Awakening, but at the time here, people are seeing God as an angry God, and you really don't hear that as much today. We think of God as a loving God. Edwards didn't use theatrics. He spoke in a calm, reasoned voice. And people like Edwards were successful getting people back to church. Between 1740 and 1742, almost 50,000 New Englanders joined churches. Now, as for Edwards, he eventually gets fired from a church because he gives one of these speeches, and one man commits suicide because he's so afraid of what's happening to him. So if there are more churches, that means you need more ministers. That means you're going to need more colleges. You already had Harvard, William and Mary, and Yale, but new colleges founded because of the Great Awakening include Princeton, Columbia, Brown, Rutgers, Dartmouth, what you would call the Ivy League colleges. The Great Awakening permanently implanted in American culture evangelical principles. It weakened the old-fashioned clergy, and it encouraged believers to exercise their own judgment. It also resulted in a proliferation of denominations across the colonies, which meant that you had to have a greater need for religious toleration. All right, so our next lecture will be English administration of the colonies, and then we'll move on to colonial wars, and then we'll start gearing up for the American Revolution.